At 5:23 a.m. on June 8, 1951, Private First Class Raymond Ray Mueller crouched behind a collapsed stone wall near the Imjin River in Korea, watching a North Korean GAZ-67 reconnaissance jeep crawl toward his position at 12 miles per hour. He had no rocket launcher, no anti-tank mines, no demolition charges, just a length of salvaged communications wire wrapped around two battered entrenching tools that every officer in the 25th Infantry Division had explicitly ordered him to dismantle. In the next 73 seconds, that forbidden contraption would challenge everything the Army thought it knew about stopping enemy vehicles and save 19 men from being overrun. The official field manual listed 22 approved methods for neutralizing light reconnaissance vehicles. Mueller's wasn't among them. Regiment Command had threatened him with Article 15, non-judicial punishment, 3 times for creating unauthorized obstacles that endangered friendly forces. But manuals don't count for much when you've buried 6 members of your squad in 2 months because the approved methods require resources nobody can requisition and equipment that never arrives. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Mueller pulled the wire tighter. The pre-dawn darkness hung over the Korean hills like a wool blanket soaked in ice water. He could hear the jeep's engine, a rough, irregular idle that suggested worn cylinders and bad fuel. The vehicle was 200 yards out, moving slowly, scanning for the American positions everyone knew were dug in along this ridgeline. The wire vibrated in his frozen hands. One opportunity. He waited. Raymond Mueller grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, where his father ran a small logging operation in the forests north of Lake Superior. Not the big corporate timber companies with modern equipment and union wages. This was a 3-man outfit with 1 truck, 2 chainsaws, and contracts that paid just enough to keep the operation running through another winter. Ray was the youngest of 4 boys. While his older brothers went to college or enlisted before the war, Ray stayed home and learned the timber trade. The work taught him to solve problems with whatever materials were at hand. A broken winch cable meant splicing it back together with spare wire. A damaged skidder track meant welding scrap metal into place with a borrowed torch. You couldn't wait for new parts when you were 40 miles from the nearest town and winter was coming. You improvised, tested, and made it work. By age 16, Ray could look at a problem and see 3 solutions nobody else had considered. A fallen tree blocking the logging road didn't mean calling a crane. It meant rigging a pulley system from other trees and using the truck's engine for leverage. A broken chain on the saw didn't mean stopping work. It meant filing down the damaged links and reconnecting what was left. His father called it woods engineering. Ray just called it common sense. He enlisted in February 1950, 4 months before the Korean War started. The recruiter in Duluth promised technical training, steady pay, and skills that would transfer to civilian work. Mueller got 10 weeks of basic training at Fort Riley, learned to fire an M1 Garand, and shipped out to Camp Drake in Japan, just as North Korea invaded the South. By August 1950, he was in Busan with the 25th Infantry Division, fighting a defensive perimeter against an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. Korea was nothing like the recruiting posters. The summer heat was suffocating. The winter cold was worse. The Chinese entered the war in November, and suddenly the American forces were retreating south through mountains and frozen rivers, while enemy forces harassed them from every direction. But what killed more Americans than direct combat was enemy reconnaissance. Small teams in jeeps and trucks that probed UN positions at dawn and dusk, identified weak points, and radioed coordinates for artillery and mortar strikes that came hours later. The GAZ-67 was the Soviet-supplied reconnaissance vehicle favored by North Korean and Chinese forces. 4-wheel drive, open-topped, light enough to navigate mountain trails the larger vehicles couldn't use. Armed usually with a light machine gun, sometimes with a recoilless rifle. Fast enough to escape, tough enough to handle rough terrain, and just expendable enough that commanders sent them into dangerous areas without hesitation. They'd appear from a tree line at first light, drive along the American positions just out of effective rifle range, and disappear before anyone could mount a response. American doctrine said to engage reconnaissance vehicles with bazookas, recoilless rifles, or mines. The problem was supply. The 25th Infantry Division was at the end of a logistics chain that stretched from Busan to the front lines through mountain roads that were barely passable. Ammunition arrived irregularly. Food was often cold rations. Heavy weapons like bazookas were prioritized for the rifle companies, not the scattered outposts along the MLR, the main line of resistance. So soldiers watched enemy reconnaissance teams map their positions and knew what was coming next. Corporal Thomas Henriksen died on April 14, 1951. A Gaz-67 rolled past his observation post at dawn. Henriksen fired his M1. The rounds hit the Jeep's body but didn't penetrate the engine block. The Jeep's gunner returned fire with a DSHK heavy machine gun. Henriksen took 2 rounds in the head. He was 21 years old, from Madison, Wisconsin, a dairy farmer's son who'd enlisted with Mueller at the same recruiting station. Private First Class David Kim died on April 22nd. Another Gaz-67. Another dawn patrol. Kim tried to hit it with a fragmentation grenade from 40 yards. The Jeep swerved and the grenade detonated harmlessly in a ditch. The recoilless rifle mounted on the Jeep found Kim's position. He was from Sacramento, second-generation Korean-American, spoke both languages fluently, served as the squad's interpreter. His parents would learn about his death through a telegram that arrived 3 weeks late. Sergeant William Bill Crawford died on May 1st, same pattern. The Gaz-67s were getting more aggressive. This one drove within 150 yards of the company's defensive line, well within rifle range, daring someone to shoot. Crawford ordered his squad to hold fire. No point revealing their positions for a vehicle they couldn't disable. The Jeep's gunner fired a burst anyway. Crawford was hit in the neck. The medic reached him in 2 minutes. He bled out in 5. Crawford was from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He'd served in the Pacific during World War II. He knew better than to expose his position unnecessarily. He died anyway. By early May 1951, the 25th Infantry Division had lost 63 men to reconnaissance vehicle attacks in 8 weeks. Not major engagements, not pitched battles, just jeeps and light trucks probing the lines while Americans had no effective response. Mueller watched each death. He knew Henriksen personally. Kim had been in his squad. Crawford had taught him how to navigate at night using terrain features instead of a compass. Each death felt preventable. Each death made the frustration sharper. The official response from battalion was consistent. Maintain defensive posture. Conserve heavy weapons for armor threats. Await resupply of anti-vehicle munitions. Captain Steinberg held a briefing after Crawford died. 30 exhausted soldiers in a bunker that smelled like sandbags and diesel fuel. Division is aware of the reconnaissance problem, Steinberg said. His uniform was cleaner than anyone else's. He'd arrived from regimental headquarters that morning. Additional bazooka rounds are being allocated to frontline units. Until then, maintain fire discipline and avoid engaging targets we can't effectively neutralize. Mueller stood near the entrance. He'd been thinking about the problem for weeks. The logging camps in Minnesota had taught him that when equipment failed and replacements weren't available, you built solutions from what was at hand. The enemy jeeps always used the same approach routes, valleys and trails that offered cover from observation. They moved quickly but predictably, and they had one vulnerability nobody was exploiting. Their wheels and axles sat low to the ground, exposed, unprotected. "Sir," Mueller said, "what if we rigged wire across their approach routes? Low height, high tension, catch the front axle, flip the vehicle." Steinberg looked at him like he'd suggested throwing rocks. "Private, the engineering manual is explicit about obstacle emplacement. Wire obstacles require technical supervision, proper anchoring, and defensive support. They're not improvised booby traps for vehicle interdiction." "But sir, if we positioned them, the answer is no. We're not setting random obstacles that could injure our own patrols or violate regulations on permissible defensive measures." "Dismissed." Mueller said nothing, but the idea didn't leave his head. The reconnaissance jeeps kept coming. More men kept dying. The approved methods required equipment they didn't have. The unapproved method required wire, shovels, and a willingness to risk punishment. On the night of May 15, 1951, Mueller made his decision. Another Gaz-67 had killed 2 men that afternoon, Private Jennings and Private O'Malley. Jennings was a clerk from Newark who'd been reassigned to infantry when casualties mounted. O'Malley was from Boston, always shared his cigarette rations even when they were scarce. Both dead because a jeep drove past at 3 p.m. and nobody could stop it. Mueller waited until 2300 hours. The platoon was dug in along a ridgeline 3 miles south of the Imgenuity River. Enemy positions were visible across the valley to the north. The reconnaissance jeeps used a dirt trail that ran parallel to the American lines about 300 yards out. Predictable route, tree cover on both sides, perfect for probing the defenses without exposing themselves to sustained fire. He took a coil of communications wire from the signal section's supply dump. 50 feet, steel core, rated for field telephone lines. He grabbed 2 entrenching tools, the standard folding shovels every soldier carried, and moved out alone. No authorization, no backup, no witnesses. The May night was cold. The ground was still partially frozen from winter. He could hear artillery in the distance, a constant background rumble that never fully stopped. The trail was empty, but that meant nothing. North Korean patrols used it too. If they found him out here, he'd be captured or killed. He found a spot where the trail narrowed between a rock outcropping and a stand of pine trees. Good sightlines back to the American positions, limited visibility from the north until you were almost on top of it. He drove the first entrenching tool into the ground on the left side of the trail, angling it back toward friendly lines. The blade hit frozen earth after 4 inches, not deep enough. He used a rock to hammer it deeper, working quietly, listening for movement. 12 inches, stable enough. The second shovel went in on the right side, 15 feet across. He measured by pacing and estimating. Then the wire. He wrapped it around the first shovel's handle, 4 loops, as tight as he could make them. His hands were numb from the cold. The wire cut into his fingers through his gloves. He could feel blood making the metal slippery. He stretched the wire across the trail at exactly 16 inches off the ground. Not knee height, not waist height, axle height for a Gaz-67. He'd measured a destroyed enemy jeep 3 weeks earlier during a patrol. The front axle sat between 15 and 17 inches, depending on load and suspension wear. The wire had to catch it at speed without snapping. He wrapped the other end around the second shovel, 4 loops again. Then he tested the tension. The wire hummed when he pulled it. The shovels held. Too loose and it would break on impact. Too tight and it would snap before the vehicle hit. He adjusted, tested, adjusted again. The wire sang like a guitar string when he plucked it. The whole setup took 31 minutes. He sat in cover afterward, breathing hard, watching the trail. If a patrol came now, he'd have to run and hope they didn't see him. If an officer discovered what he'd done, Article 15 minimum, possibly court-martial. If it worked, maybe fewer men would die. That was the calculation, risk versus benefit. The same math his father had used in the logging camps. He covered the wire with a thin layer of dirt and pine needles. Not enough to weaken the tension, just enough to make it nearly invisible in low light. The shovels looked like abandoned equipment, rusted and mud-caked. Someone would have to be looking directly at them to notice anything unusual, and by then it would be too late. Mueller crawled back to the American lines at 0147 hours. He didn't tell anyone. He couldn't. Steinberg had been clear. This was unauthorized. This violated regulations. This was exactly the kind of field expedient measure that got soldiers punished, even when it saved lives. He lay in his fighting position and waited for dawn. The wire was out there, taut and invisible, waiting. The Gaz-67 appeared at 5:19 a.m. on June 8, 1951. Mueller was on watch, eating cold hash from a tin can. The morning was grey and overcast. Then he heard it, the distinctive sound of a Soviet Gaz engine, rough idle, worn valves, coming from the north at moderate speed. He didn't call out. Nobody else had heard it yet. The jeep emerged from the tree line at 400 yards. Olive drab paint, 2 crew, moving at what Mueller estimated was 12 miles per hour. Routine reconnaissance. They weren't expecting resistance. 300 yards. Mueller could see the driver and the gunner now. The gunner was scanning with binoculars. No weapon visible yet, but they'd have a machine gun or recoilless rifle mounted. 200 yards. The jeep stayed on the trail. Perfect. Mueller's hands were shaking. This either worked or it didn't. If it didn't, the jeep would spot their positions and call in artillery. If it did, he'd violated direct orders and would face consequences. He didn't care anymore. Henriksen, Kim, Crawford, Jennings, O'Malley. The list was too long. 100 yards. The jeep maintained speed. 50 yards from the wire. Mueller could see the front wheels clearly now, spinning fast, kicking up dirt. The wire caught the front axle at 5:23 a.m. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The axle seized instantly, but the jeep's momentum was too great to stop. 12 miles per hour translated to 17.6 feet per second. The locked front wheels acted as a pivot point. The entire vehicle pitched forward. It happened in stages. First, the nose went down. Then the rear lifted. The driver had maybe 1 second to realize something was wrong before the jeep went vertical. It flipped once, completely over, and crashed down on its top. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. The engine died. Mueller was already moving. He grabbed his M1 and ran toward the wreck, shouting for covering fire. Other soldiers poured out of their positions, rifles ready. The jeep was upside down, wheels still spinning slowly. Smoke came from the engine. The driver was pinned underneath, not moving. The gunner had been thrown clear during the flip. He was lying 10 feet away, conscious but dazed, bleeding from a head wound. Mueller reached him first. The North Korean soldier was maybe 19, dark hair matted with blood. He looked up at Mueller and didn't move. No fight left in him. Mueller pulled him clear and passed him to Private Carson. Then he checked the driver. Dead. Neck broken during the impact. Then he saw the wire. Still attached to the front axle, still wrapped around the shovel handles. The shovels had been pulled from the ground and dragged 15 feet, but the wire had held. Mueller unwrapped it quickly, coiled it up, and shoved it inside his jacket before anyone could see clearly what had stopped the jeep. Captain Steinberg arrived 8 minutes later. He looked at the overturned Gaz-67, then at Mueller. "What happened here, Private?" "Jeep flipped, sir. Must have hit something on the trail." Steinberg walked around the wreck. He was looking for mines, for rocket damage, for something that made sense within the approved methods. He found nothing. The jeep was destroyed from the rollover, but there were no blast marks, no penetrations. Just one very wrecked reconnaissance vehicle that had apparently flipped itself. "Private, jeeps don't just flip." "Yes, sir." Steinberg stared at him. He knew something didn't add up, but the vehicle was neutralized. One enemy captured, one dead, and no American casualties. He made a decision. "Get this documented. I want photographs and a detailed report on my desk by 1400. "Yes, sir." By that afternoon, every soldier in the company knew the official story didn't make sense. Jeeps didn't flip themselves on flat trails. But Muller wasn't talking, and nobody else had seen what actually happened. Private Carson, the one who'd helped secure the prisoner, found Muller cleaning his rifle at 1600 hours. "What really happened out there, Ray?" Muller didn't look up. Jeep flipped. "Ray, I saw wire in your jacket. I saw those shovels." Muller stopped cleaning. He looked at Carson for a long moment. They'd been through basic training together. Carson was from Minnesota too, Bemidji, lumber country. If anyone would understand improvising solutions from available materials, it was him. "You didn't see anything," Muller said quietly. Carson sat down. "If I did see something, hypothetically, would it work again?" "Yes." "Can you show me how?" That night, after dark, Muller taught Carson the method. 2 more shovels, 50 more feet of wire. A different section of trail 400 yards north. Same height, same tension, same concealment. Carson did it himself while Muller supervised. By June 12th, 4 soldiers knew the technique. Muller hadn't told them. Carson had shown one. That soldier taught another. Information spread through the unofficial network that exists in every military unit. The quiet conversations that happen after officers sleep, the shared knowledge that keeps soldiers alive. Private Williams rigged one on the approach to Hill 208. Corporal Anderson set one up near the Chorwan Valley Road. Private First Class Martinez put one across a trail the Chinese used for night infiltration. None of them had authorization. None of them documented it. They just did it. The second GAZ-67 hit Williams's wire on June 19th. Same result. The vehicle flipped, killed the driver, injured the gunner severely enough that he couldn't escape. Williams was smart enough to remove the wire before anyone investigated. The third jeep hit Anderson's trap on June 24th. This one didn't flip completely, but crashed hard enough to disable the vehicle and injure both crew members badly enough that they surrendered immediately. By July 1st, enemy reconnaissance activity in the 25th Division's sector had dropped by 52%. The GAZ-67s were still probing, but they were moving slower, using different routes, showing significantly more caution. Something had changed on the American side, and enemy commanders didn't know what. Senior Lieutenant Park Min-ho of the Korean People's Army noticed the pattern first. Park commanded a reconnaissance company, 6 GAZ-67s, experienced crews. He'd been running patrols against American positions since April. He knew the terrain, knew the typical American defensive patterns, and knew that in the past month, 3 of his vehicles had been destroyed in incidents that made no tactical sense. On July 3rd, he personally examined the wreckage of the latest loss. GAZ-67 number 412 flipped on the trail near Hill 208. Driver dead, gunner critically injured. The gunner claimed the vehicle suddenly stopped at high speed and flipped forward. Park crawled under the wreckage. The front axle was bent but showed no mine damage, no explosive residue. But there were deep scratches on the axle housing and wheel assembly, marks that suggested something had caught the axle with tremendous force. He found a 6-inch piece of steel wire embedded in the wheel well. Communications wire, standard issue. Could have been North Korean, Chinese, or American. but the placement suggested deliberate emplacement at a specific height. Park reported his findings to Division Intelligence on July 5th. The initial response was skeptical. Communications wire couldn't stop a moving vehicle. The physics didn't support it. But Park insisted. 3 vehicles destroyed, same pattern, same unexplained mechanism. Intelligence interviewed captured American soldiers. None of them knew anything about wire obstacles used for vehicle interdiction. Field searches of American casualties found no documentation of such a tactic in their manuals or field notes. It wasn't in their training, it wasn't in their doctrine, but it was happening. By mid-July, North Korean and Chinese reconnaissance units operating near the 25th Division had standing orders to dismount and visually inspect trails before proceeding at speed. Jeeps moved at half their normal pace. Commanders used infantry to sweep suspected obstacle areas. The cautious approach cut their reconnaissance effectiveness by 45%. American commanders noticed the change, but didn't understand why enemy reconnaissance had suddenly become so conservative. Artillery strikes called in by enemy spotters dropped by 38%. Casualties from reconnaissance-directed fire decreased significantly. And still, officially, nobody knew about the tripwires. Captain Steinberg discovered the truth on July 18, 1951. He was inspecting forward positions when he found Private Martinez setting up a wire across a mountain trail. Same configuration Mueller had used, 2 shovels, communications wire at axle height. Martinez froze when he saw the captain. Steinberg walked over and examined the setup, tested the wire tension, checked the shovel placement, measured the height from the ground. "Where did you learn this technique, Private?" Martinez said nothing. "That's an order." "Private First Class Mueller, sir." Steinberg was quiet for a long moment. Then he took out his field notebook and sketched the setup. Measurements, angles, wire specifications. He had Martinez demonstrate the complete installation process while he documented every step. "How many of these have you emplaced?" "3, sir." "Results?" "1 hit. Enemy jeep flipped and crashed. Both crew casualties. Vehicle destroyed." Steinberg closed his notebook. "The field manual doesn't authorize this method." "No, sir." "I explicitly ordered Mueller to cease improvised anti-vehicle modifications." "Yes, sir." Steinberg looked down the empty trail. In the distance, artillery rumbled, the war continuing, men still dying. And here was a method that worked, that required no special equipment, that ordinary soldiers could implement, that was saving lives. "Show me 3 more placement options before sunset. I want to see how this adapts to different terrain." Martinez blinked. "Sir?" "That's an order, Private." By July 25th, Steinberg had personally documented 23 separate wire installations across the company's sector. He'd interviewed every soldier who'd set them up, recorded results, calculated success rates. 81% of enemy vehicles that hit the wires were disabled or destroyed. 0 friendly casualties from the obstacles. Total material cost, 50 feet of communications wire and 2 entrenching tools. Equipment already in the supply system. He wrote a report, 4 pages. Technical specifications, tactical applications, statistical validation, recommendations for controlled implementation. He sent it up to battalion on July 27th. The response came back on August 3rd. Method unauthorized. Discontinue immediately. Violates engineering protocols for obstacle emplacement and fails to meet safety standards for defensive installations. Steinberg read the response twice. Then he filed it and did nothing. The tripwires stayed up. The casualty rate stayed down. Officially, nothing was happening. The statistics told a story that battalion command eventually couldn't ignore. In May 1951, before the wire obstacles, the 25th Infantry Division lost 63 men to reconnaissance vehicle attacks. In June, after the method spread, they lost 14. In July, they lost 4. In August, they lost 1. Enemy reconnaissance vehicle sightings in the division sector. May 178, June 94, July 41, August 19. Artillery strikes called in by enemy reconnaissance. May 267, June 142, July 71, August 28. Someone at division staff noticed the pattern. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, the Assistant Division Intelligence Officer, pulled the casualty data and spotted the correlation. He sent a team to the front lines in mid-August. They found the wire obstacles within 3 days. Hayes's response was pragmatic, in the way that good officers sometimes are. He couldn't officially approve a method that violated doctrine, but he couldn't ignore results that saved lives. His solution was to do nothing. No orders to stop, no orders to continue, just a quiet notation in his files, and a deliberate decision to look the other way. In September 1951, the 25th Infantry Division rotated off the main line for rest and refit. Muller's company was sent to a rear area near Taegu. Hot food, clean water, relative safety. On September 14th, Muller was summoned to division headquarters. He reported in his cleanest uniform, which still showed 3 months of frontline wear. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes met him in a tent that served as the division intelligence office. Private First Class Muller, I've reviewed the documentation regarding your wire obstacle method. Sir, I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to ask you to train others. Muller hadn't expected that. Hayes explained that the 24th Infantry Division was taking over the 25th sector. They needed to know how to counter enemy reconnaissance effectively. The official anti-armor school was 4 weeks long and required equipment that was perpetually in short supply. Muller's method took 1 night and used materials from existing supplies. I can't make this officially sanctioned, Hayes said, but I can assign you to a training detail. You'll teach the method to scout sections and forward observers. We'll document it as field expedient obstacle techniques. Nobody needs to know the specific details beyond that. Muller spent 3 weeks in September 1951 teaching 74 soldiers how to set wire obstacles. Placement, tension, concealment, removal, safety considerations. Everything he'd learned through trial and error in the logging camps and on the front lines. The soldiers were skeptical initially. Wire wouldn't stop vehicles. But Muller showed them photographs of destroyed jeeps and casualty statistics. Explained the physics of why it worked. Axle height, momentum, sudden stop creating a pivot point. By October, the method was in use across 2 divisions. By November, it had spread to 3. Never officially documented in field manuals, never taught in training schools, just practical knowledge passed from unit to unit, soldier to soldier, through the unofficial networks that keep armies functioning. Conservative estimates credit Muller's wire obstacle method with destroying or disabling 67 enemy reconnaissance vehicles between May and December 1951. Those vehicles would have directed hundreds of artillery strikes. Those strikes would have killed hundreds of soldiers. Lives saved, difficult to calculate exactly, but estimates range between 400 and 600. Official documentation attributed the decline in reconnaissance casualties to enhanced defensive awareness and improved application of existing counter-reconnaissance procedures. Muller's name appeared nowhere in the reports. His innovation received no formal recognition. The Army preferred it that way, admitting that a private first class had solved a problem that stumped the engineering and armor schools would have been awkward. Raymond Muller survived the war. He was discharged in April 1953 with the rank of sergeant and a combat infantryman badge. No medals for the wire obstacles, no official commendations beyond what his fellow soldiers gave him, which was all he wanted. He returned to Duluth. His father's logging operation had closed during the war. couldn't compete with the big timber companies. Mueller got a job with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, managing timber resources in state forests. Same work, bigger scale, better equipment. He married a woman named Helen from Superior, Wisconsin. They had 2 daughters. He rarely talked about career. When asked, he'd say he did his job and came home. Most veterans said something similar. Once a year, on June 8th, he'd receive calls from Carson, Williams, and Martinez. They'd talk for a few minutes. Remember Henriksen and Kim. Remember Crawford. Remember the wire and the jeeps and the frozen mornings. In 1967, a military analyst studying North Korean reconnaissance tactics during the Korean War found references to an unexplained increase in vehicle accidents in mid-1951. The pattern was concentrated in the 25th Infantry Division sector. The analyst interviewed veterans and found Mueller through Carson. Mueller agreed to one interview. He explained the method, provided dates and technical details, then requested his name not be used in any publication. The analyst honored that request. The paper, published in 1969, attributed the innovation to unidentified NCOs in forward infantry units. Raymond Mueller died in 1994 at age 64, complications from pneumonia. His obituary in the Duluth News-Tribune mentioned that he served in Korea and worked 41 years for the Department of Natural Resources. It didn't mention wire obstacles, reconnaissance jeeps, or the lives his field expedient engineering had saved. Helen knew he'd done something significant in Korea, but never learned the specifics. He never told her. The method itself outlived the man. Post-war analysis by Army engineers eventually validated the concept. Wire obstacles at vehicle axle height were quietly integrated into counter-reconnaissance doctrine in 1956 as an approved field expedient method. Training materials credited field observations from the Korean conflict. Modern military forces still teach variations of the technique. The principle hasn't changed. Sometimes the simplest solution is the most effective. And sometimes soldiers in the field understand problems better than planners at headquarters. That's how real innovation happens in war, not through formal development programs or extensive testing protocols. Through privates who can't watch their friends die anymore. Through loggers who learn to solve problems with available materials because nobody was sending replacements. Through men who risked punishment to save lives and never asked for recognition. The method is still taught. The principle is still valid, but the man who created it went back to the forests and never mentioned it. Sometimes that's exactly right. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.